74,000 years ago, the world changed in a single moment of fire. A mountain deep in Sumatra split the sky, and what it unleashed would shroud the earth in shadow for decades. It was not just another eruption. It was one of the greatest cataclysms our species has ever faced, an event that nearly erased us before our story had truly begun. Imagine living in that fragile age when humans were few, scattered in small groups across Africa and Asia, unaware that the fate of every generation to come balanced on the edge of survival. Hello there, and welcome to BoneAge. My name is Thomas. Tonight I want to take you back into that moment of unthinkable catastrophe to explore what scientists call the Toba supereruption, the volcanic winter that reduced humanity to only a few thousand souls, a bottleneck so narrow we should not have survived it at all. Think of it this way. The world we know today, with billions of people, endless cities, and voices echoing across the globe, very nearly ended in silence. All of it, art, memory, music, language, almost gone, smothered under a sky of ash. What if survival itself was a miracle? What if, out of every human who once walked the earth, only a few clung to life in caves, huddled beside fires that burned low against the freezing dark? Could it be that the reason you are here, listening now, traces back to those nights when the sun disappeared and the air itself turned bitter and cold? We won't be rushing to conclusions tonight. This isn't a debate, it's an exploration, a journey into a past where the earth itself tested us and nearly found us wanting. Scientists see the evidence in the ice, in the ash, and in the quiet signatures written in our DNA. But perhaps the deeper story lies in what cannot be measured, the terror, the resilience, and the unimaginable endurance it took for a few fragile tribes to carry the flame of humanity forward. Before we step into the fire, let's first return to the world as it was. Before the mountain stirred, before the ash fell, when humans still held a tentative foothold on a wild and unforgiving earth. The air of that world was heavy with silence, broken only by the crackle of firewood or the distant call of night creatures. 74,000 years ago, there were no cities, no roads, no empires carved into stone. Instead, there were scattered bands of early humans, our ancestors, moving carefully across the wide plains of Africa and into the varied landscapes of Asia. Their numbers were small, so small that if you were to gather every man, woman, and child together, they could not have filled a single modern stadium, and yet these tiny communities held within them the entire future of humanity. You can picture them if you close your eyes. A group of 20 or 30 individuals, faces illuminated by a shared fire, their breath rising into the cool night. The glow of the flames paints their shelters, perhaps little more than branches leaned together, or the dark mouth of a cave that offers protection from wind. Every decision they made was shaped by survival. Every sunrise brought a question. Where will the next meal come from, and how long can we hold on to this fragile safety? The landscapes they knew were not barren wastelands, but living, shifting theaters of danger and opportunity. Across Africa, great herds of antelope, zebra, and aurochs thundered across the grasslands, prey for the hunters, but also fiercely defended by tooth and horn. In the forests and thickets, leopards watched from shadows, crocodiles lingered near the rivers where tribes came to drink, and beyond the immediate dangers of predator and prey lay the deeper challenge, climate. The earth was already restless. Ice ages and warmer interludes came and went, shaping where animals could thrive, where humans could follow. These early humans, Homo sapiens, were not alone on their journey. Neanderthals roamed Europe, and parts of Western Asia, powerful stocky hunters built for the cold. In the islands of Southeast Asia, Homo erectus still lingered, descendants of a species that had endured for nearly 2 million years, and perhaps in isolated places, other human cousins walked the earth as well, each branch carrying its own story of survival. The world was not yet ours alone. It was a shared experiment, a fragile balance between species that were more alike than different. But for all their vulnerability, Homo sapiens carried something distinct. Their tools were sharper, their shelters more adaptable, their minds restless with creativity. Stone flakes, chipped into fine blades, could slice meat and scrape hides. Spears tipped with carefully shaped points extended the reach of the hunter's arm. Fire, when it could be kept alive, was both shield and hearth, a weapon against predators, and a gathering place for stories. Around these fires, language itself may have been forming, words carrying ideas from one mind to another, weaving memory into narrative. Imagine standing with them as night closes in. The stars are brighter than anything we know today, scattered across a sky unbroken by artificial light. The Milky Way stretches in a glowing arc, a river of fire above the dark earth. The air is cool, scented with smoke and damp grass. Around you, children huddle close to their mothers, their eyes wide with the kind of wonder that needs no explanation. Someone hums softly, a rhythm that may be the ancestor of song. Another chips at a stone, sparks flying as the shape of a blade emerges. The fire pops and cracks, throwing shadows across the ground. In that moment, you realize how precarious everything is. One predator, one drought, one unlucky accident, and the entire band could vanish, leaving nothing behind but footprints in the dirt. And yet, against all odds, they endured. Populations grew slowly, never surging and never secure, but inching outward across the landscape. From the Great Rift Valley, humans followed the rivers and coastlines, drawn by food and water. Some reached the Arabian Peninsula, crossing into lands that shimmered with heat. Others ventured into India, threading their way through dense forests where tigers stalked and elephants roamed. The spread was not steady. It pulsed with the rhythm of climate change, expanding during favorable periods, retreating when droughts or ice closed in. Archaeological traces reveal the fragility of this foothold. In southern Africa, caves preserve evidence of early humans who cracked open shells for food, ground pigments for color, and crafted tools that spoke of innovation. Along the coasts of India, stone flakes suggest settlements that rose and fell with the tides of survival. In Southeast Asia, evidence hints at interactions, perhaps distant echoes of contact, between sapiens and the long-lived Homo erectus. Each fragment tells us the same story. We were not secure, not dominant, but a species trying to carve out its place in a world that cared nothing for our survival, and survival required cooperation. These were not solitary beings wandering alone. They moved as groups, sharing tasks, protecting one another, pooling knowledge. A skilled hunter might provide meat, but the gatherers knew where roots and berries could be found. The elders carried memory, guiding migrations by recalling when rivers swelled or when game moved across the plains. The young learned by watching, imitating, absorbing skills that could mean the difference between life and death. Every member had a role, and without the group, no one could endure for long. Still, the dangers pressed in from all sides. Predators were one threat, but starvation was another. A failed hunt, a sudden storm, an injury that slowed the pace, any of these could unravel the delicate balance of survival. And beyond the immediate struggles, there loomed something larger, something invisible, the Earth's restless mantle, the forces moving beneath the crust, pressures building in silence. The humans of 74,000 years ago could not have known it. But far to the east, in the lush island of Sumatra, a mountain was stirring, but before that awakening, the world carried on as it always had. Days began with the searching of tracks, the scanning of the horizon for herds. Midday brought heat, the air buzzing with insects, while the hunters prepared tools and the gatherers sought food. Evening gathered them back together, returning once more to the fire, where flickering light softened the sharp edges of fear. In these hours bonds were forged, not just of survival, but of kinship, of memory, of story. What would it have felt like to live then, knowing only the immediate horizon, the dangers close at hand, never suspecting that the true peril was rising far away, hidden beneath stone? What if you had been one of them, your life small in scope, but part of something vast, fragile, and unspoken? Perhaps you would have felt the fragility, sensed that life was always just one step away from collapse. Or perhaps you would have felt only the rhythm of each day, unaware of how close humanity already was to the edge. And that brings us to the question that shadows this chapter of our past. How does a species so vulnerable endure long enough to face the unimaginable? How does a small band of humans, scattered across 2 continents, carry within them the strength to survive what was coming? To understand that, we must turn east to the restless heart of Sumatra, where the ground itself trembled with a force that would change the destiny of our species. The island of Sumatra, cloaked in deep green forests and veined with rivers, lay upon a restless seam of the earth. Beneath its surface, plates of crust pressed and shifted, the grinding of ancient tectonics building pressure in silence. To those who lived then, there was no map of fault lines, no understanding of the molten heart below. There was only the land they walked upon, the rivers they followed, the mountains that rose like guardians in the distance. And yet, within one of those mountains, the seeds of catastrophe had already been planted long before humans ever looked upon its slopes. This was Mount Toba, an immense caldera, even in its quiet years dwarfing the imagination. To us it is remembered as one of the largest volcanic structures on Earth, but to the humans of 74,000 years ago, it was simply another peak in a world of peaks. Perhaps they saw its summit veiled in cloud, the ridges jagged against the sky. Perhaps they passed near its forests, hearing the calls of birds and the rustle of animals in the undergrowth. To them it was silent, unremarkable, but inside a furnace was stirring. Imagine living close to its shadow in those days. The ground would sometimes whisper, subtle tremors, a vibration felt through bare feet pressed to the soil. Animals may have shifted nervously, herds breaking apart without reason. A distant plume might have occasionally drifted into the sky, mistaken for a passing storm, but no one could have imagined the scale of what was coming, for nothing in their world had prepared them for it. Even to us, the true size is nearly incomprehensible. When Toba finally erupted, it expelled more than 2,800 cubic kilometers of material. That number is vast, almost meaningless, until you imagine it as 40 Mount St. Helens, exploding at once, or nearly 3,000 times the ash and fire of Vesuvius, the mountain that buried Pompeii. Scientists estimate the force was equal to billions of Hiroshima barrier bombs detonating together. It was not merely a volcano, it was an event that reshaped the global climate. But we are running ahead of ourselves. For now, we remain in the moments before. Picture the air heavy with anticipation that no one could name. Across Sumatra, lakes shimmered in the heat, forests breathed with life, and tribes of early humans went about their days unaware. Children played near rivers, Hunters sharpened tools, gatherers reached for fruits and roots in the undergrowth. The world was ordinary, the sky blue, the air sweet with humidity. No one looked to the mountain and thought it would betray them. And yet the signs must have grown. Tremors turning to earthquakes, birds scattering in sudden flight, water rippling with disturbances from deep below. In the heart of the earth, magma surged upward, trapped within chambers that strained against stone. The pressure mounted, unstoppable, until even the mountain could no longer hold it back. Speculation allows us to wonder, what did those last days feel like to those nearest? Did the nights grow louder, with rumblings echoing from the ground? Did smoke rise steadily into the sky, a dark column that unsettled the hunters who looked upon it? Perhaps they did not linger to wonder. Perhaps they turned away, choosing to move further east or west, guided by instinct to flee, even if they did not understand why. For those who remained, the answer would come in fire. When the eruption began, it would not have been gentle. First, an explosion, a sound like the sky tearing apart, a roar that rolled across valleys and plains. The summit split open, releasing jets of ash and flame that climbed into the heavens. Entire forests were incinerated in moments, animals swallowed in a flood of fire and rock. The earth itself fractured, sending rivers of lava pouring outward, burying everything in their path. Above, the eruption column rose higher and higher, punching into the stratosphere, higher than storms, higher than any cloud. Ash particles began to drift, carried on winds that would scatter them across continents. Day turned to twilight. Twilight turned to night. But this was only the beginning. Supereruptions are not brief events. They unfold in stages, each one more terrible than the last. Pyroclastic flows, waves of incandescent gas, and rock moving faster than storms, tore down the slopes at hundreds of miles per hour. Nothing could outrun them, nothing could survive in their path. Lakes boiled, forests vaporized, whole valleys became graveyards of ash. If you had been standing even miles away, the air itself would have turned against you, hot, suffocating, filled with fine particles that seared lungs. If you had turned to flee, your steps would have been swallowed by falling ash, each breath choking as the sky rained fragments of stone. For those caught nearby, there was no escape. The world ended in moments, and still the mountain didn't stop. For days, for weeks, perhaps longer, Toba poured its fury into the air. Ash clouds spread outward like a living thing, carried by the jet stream across India, the Middle East, Africa. The sound of the eruption may have circled the globe, rolling like thunder across oceans. We can only imagine what distant humans thought as they looked upward and saw the sun dim behind strange veils. Perhaps they whispered among themselves, fearful of omens. Perhaps they huddled closer to fires, uneasy though they did not yet know why. A mountain they had never seen was already changing their fate. The geological record confirms what their eyes must have witnessed. Layers of ash, meters thick, still lie buried in the soil of India, Malaysia, and the Indian Ocean. Ice cores drilled from Antarctica and Greenland carry chemical traces of the eruption, signals of a planet-wide winter that followed. The Earth itself keeps memory, even when no human voice survives to tell it. And yet, it is not only geology that speaks. Our own DNA carries the echo. Genetic evidence shows that around this time, humanity's numbers collapsed, reduced to only a few thousand breeding individuals. It is as though Toba reached across continents, silencing entire populations until only a fragile remnant endured. We are all descendants of that remnant, each of us carrying the legacy of fire and ash in our blood. What if the survivors who looked upon that darkened sky understood something we cannot? Perhaps they felt the fragility of existence more keenly than we do. Perhaps they understood, in ways beyond words, that survival was never promised, that the earth itself could turn hostile without warning. And yet they endured, not by conquering, not by mastery, but by persistence, by firelight, by the bonds that held them together in the long night. The awakening of Toba was not simply a geological event. It was a turning point in our story. For without it, we might have spread too quickly, too widely, our numbers growing beyond the fragile balance of survival. Instead, we were tested, reduced, sharpened by the trial. It is possible that even our intelligence, our capacity for cooperation, our hunger to adapt were forged in the crucible of that disaster. What nearly ended us may have also defined us, but this opens another question. If the eruption was so powerful, if it dimmed the sun and froze the earth, what did the day itself look like when fire swallowed the sky? What was it like to stand on the edge of that cataclysm, to see daylight vanish and night stretch endlessly forward? To answer that, we must step into the very heart of the eruption itself, the day of fire, when the earth erupted in fury and the sky became a furnace. The first breath of it would have been silence, the kind of silence that comes just before the world breaks. A mountain split open, and the air itself seemed to hesitate. Then came the sound, a roar beyond hearing, a vibration that shook the chest and rattled the bones, as if the sky itself had been torn apart. In that instant, Mount Toba ceased to be a mountain and became something else entirely, a wound in the earth, a furnace unbound. From its heart surged a column of fire and ash that clawed upward into the heavens. It rose past clouds, past storms, past every familiar ceiling of the sky until it reached the stratosphere, more than 20 miles above the earth. Ash clouds spread like wings of darkness, carried on winds that could circle the globe. The day, once bright with sun, dimmed to an eerie twilight. The shadows lengthened, stretched, and then dissolved altogether into a false night. Imagine standing at a distance, far from the immediate destruction, yet close enough to see the spectacle. The horizon is swallowed in flame, the mountain a pillar of burning stone. The ground trembles beneath your feet, the air alive with heat and static. Birds scatter in desperate flight, their wings glinting for a moment before vanishing into the churning black sky. Animals flee in panic, herds stampeding, predators running alongside prey, every instinct bent on escape. But there was no escape, not from this. Closer to the eruption, the earth became uninhabitable in an instant. Pyroclastic flows, avalanches of fire, ash, and gas, hotter than 1,000 degrees, raced down the slopes faster than any living thing could move. Entire forests vanished in a heartbeat, reduced to glowing embers and bone-white ash. Rivers boiled as molten rock poured into their channels, steam hissing skyward in plumes that twisted into the rising cloud. Whole valleys disappeared, buried beneath waves of rock and pumice. To speak of numbers is to understate the horror, but they help us imagine the unimaginable. Scientists estimate the force released by Toba was equivalent to billions of Hiroshima bombs detonating together. Not hundreds, not millions, billions. The sheer energy unleashed in those hours reshaped landscapes, obliterated ecosystems, and sent shockwaves across the planet. Now picture yourself not as a scientist with hindsight, but as a human caught in that day. You feel the ground shake, see the sky turn to fire. The air thickens with falling ash, coating skin and hair in grey dust, filling lungs with grit. The heat presses against you, unbearable, searing even at a distance, Every instinct tells you to run, but where? The sky itself is collapsing. Lightning forks through the ash cloud, striking the ground with blinding flashes. Thunder echoes, not from storms, but from the mountain's own rage. And yet, in that chaos, there's still detail. Ash falls like snow, soft at first, then heavy, smothering plants, clogging streams, muffling sound. The once familiar forest becomes unrecognizable, every branch bowed under the weight of soot. Fires spark and spread, igniting what little remains untouched. The world glows red, then black, then nothing at all. For those nearest to Toba, the end was swift. For those further away, hundreds, even thousands of miles distant, the day of fire was slower, stranger, more haunting. They would have seen the sun vanish behind a wall of ash, the daylight dimming into a reddish gloom. They would have felt the air grow colder even as the ground shook with aftershocks. Perhaps they wondered if the world itself was dying. Perhaps, in whispers, they tried to explain it with stories of angry spirits, of gods tearing the sky apart, of omens too vast to ignore, but the truth was even greater than any story they could tell. This was not just destruction, it was transformation. The eruption of Toba injected so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that the very chemistry of the air was altered. Sunlight could not pass through the dense veil. Temperatures plummeted. Rain turned acidic. Crops and plants withered beneath skies that no longer offered warmth. Speculation allows us to linger here, to imagine the sensory details of those who witnessed it. What was it like to drink from water turned bitter with ash, to breathe air that tasted of stone and fire, to wake each morning and find the sun a faint cold disk struggling behind veils of darkness? Imagine the children asking their mothers why the light had gone, why the days no longer warmed their skin. Imagine the elders who carried memory of seasons past, realizing that this was no ordinary storm, no passing drought. Something larger had come, and it would not leave quickly. The day of fire did not end in a single day. For weeks the mountain raged, ejecting ash and gas, collapsing its own flanks into the growing caldera. When at last the eruption subsided, the land was unrecognizable. Where once stood a towering peak, now there stretched a vast gaping crater, over 60 miles wide, later to fill with water and become what we now call Lake Toba, a scar upon the earth, visible even from space. And yet, the true devastation was not confined to Sumatra. The ash cloud spread outward, carried by winds into India, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. In some regions, ash settled meters deep, smothering landscapes, poisoning soil, killing plants before they could grow again. Across South Asia, the ground was buried under grey blankets that lingered for years, reshaping rivers, altering ecosystems. For humanity scattered and fragile, this was the beginning of the true trial. The day of fire may have burned quickly, but its shadow stretched across generations. Our species, already small in number, now faced a world darkened, poisoned, and cold. And yet there's something almost paradoxical here. Out of this destruction we endured. Somehow, against the enormity of what had happened, a few tribes clung to life, finding ways to breathe, to eat, to shelter, in a world that no longer resembled the one they had known. Their survival is written in our very DNA, a testimony to resilience forged in ash. But before survival, there was the shroud. The sun itself disappeared, the air dimmed, and the earth entered a twilight that would last not days or weeks, but years. To step into that chapter, we must follow the ash cloud as it circled the globe, blotting out the sky and plunging the planet into a volcanic night. The sky itself became unrecognizable. What had once been blue bright and boundless now thickened into a ceiling of smoke and ash. Across continents, the light of the sun was reduced to a faint red ember struggling behind the haze. Days no longer began with sunrise, nor ended with nightfall. Instead, a strange half-light stretched endlessly, a twilight that blurred morning into evening, season into season. Imagine standing on the plains of Africa as this veil descended. The warmth that had always returned with the dawn no longer touched your skin. Shadows faded into each other, indistinct, as though the world had been painted in ash. The air itself tasted different, gritty, bitter, laced with sulfur that burned the throat. Each breath became a reminder of the mountain's reach, a signal that no place on earth was beyond its touch. In India, the transformation was even harsher. Layers of ash meters thick smothered the land. Rivers clogged, fields vanished, and forests fell silent. Animals that once roamed in abundance collapsed from hunger, their food buried beneath grey blankets. Hunters found the tracks of prey disappearing into landscapes where no prey remained. What had once been fertile and green was now sterile and silent. Speculation invites us to linger here, to feel what it must have been like. Perhaps you would rise each morning, hoping to see the sun and find instead the same dim glow, the same grey canopy above. Perhaps your fire, once a comfort against the night, now seemed weak compared to the vast darkness that surrounded you. What stories would you whisper to your children when they asked if the light would return? How many days would pass before you realized that this twilight was not passing, but settling in for years? The planet itself cooled under this shroud. Without sunlight, photosynthesis faltered, plants withered, crops failed, and the balance of ecosystems crumbled. Temperatures dropped rapidly, not only in the shadow of Sumatra, but across the globe. It was as if winter had descended everywhere at once, a volcanic winter that cared nothing for latitude or season. In the frozen north, snow that should have melted lingered through summer, piling year upon year into sheets of ice. In the tropics, where heat had always ruled, nights turned bitter, mornings sharp with frost. Even in Africa, the cradle of humankind, the air grew colder, the rains less certain, the land harsher than it had ever been. Scientists studying ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica find traces of this darkness still. Layers of volcanic ash, sulfur, and chemical shifts mark the years when the sun was dimmed. The data speaks of a cooling that lasted decades, temperatures falling by several degrees across the planet. For us, that may sound minor. For them, it was catastrophic. A few degrees meant the difference between growing seasons and barren years, between prey migrating or vanishing, between life and death for entire tribes. But beyond the science, imagine the emotional weight of this twilight. Humans had always lived by rhythms of light and dark, by the returning promise of dawn. Now that rhythm was broken, the world was unfamiliar, the heavens no longer obeyed. To a people whose survival depended on careful observation of seasons and skies, this would have felt like the collapse of order itself. Perhaps it inspired terror or awe, or a silence so deep it carried into myth. And there were other signs, stranger still. The air carried a constant haze, and with it came acid rains that burned leaves and poisoned streams. Lightning flashed more often within the ash clouds, igniting what forests remained. At night the sky sometimes glowed with eerie colors, reds, purples, and strange pale lights, caused by particles scattering what little light remained. It was as though the heavens had been remade, no longer familiar, no longer safe. In the shrouded world, sound changed too. Ash muffled the air, dampening echoes, softening steps. The cries of animals grew rarer, the forests quieter. Only the wind, shifting the endless drifts of grey, broke the silence. And beneath that silence lay hunger, spreading slowly but relentlessly. Speculation allows us to follow one small group through this transformation. Imagine them in East Africa, huddled in a cave near a river. At first the strange skies unsettled them, but did not end their routines. They hunted, gathered, lit fires. But as weeks turned to months, prey grew scarce, the plants they relied on shriveled, water grew bitter, each day stretched longer, heavier, under skies that offered no relief. The children grew thinner, the hunters returned with empty hands. Fire still burned, but its glow felt fragile against the endless twilight. Some groups may have migrated, following faint signs of food. Others may have clung stubbornly to familiar lands, waiting for the sun to return. Many never saw it. For them the shroud became a tomb. Their stories ended beneath the grey silence. And yet a few endured, always a few. This endurance is written in our bones. DNA evidence shows that during this period, humanity's population collapsed to perhaps as few as several thousand breeding individuals, an entire species reduced to the size of a small town. One drought, one famine, one storm could have erased us altogether. Yet those who remained persisted, their survival strategies honed in the crucible of this volcanic night. Perhaps they learned to eat what they had never eaten before, roots bitter with toxins, insects, carrion left by dying animals. Perhaps they gathered together in larger groups than before, pooling resources, sharing fire, inventing new ways to endure. And perhaps in this twilight the seeds of deeper cooperation were sown, seeds that would one day grow into the societies, the networks, the cultures that define us now. But that is to look ahead. For now the world remained shrouded. The sun itself had disappeared, hidden behind a veil of ash that stretched across continents. Seasons lost their meaning, days lost their shape, and humanity, fragile and unknowing, entered a night that would last for decades. To move forward, we must step from this twilight into its consequence, the global fallout that followed when ash and cold reshaped every landscape, every animal, every life upon the earth. The ash did not remain in Sumatra. Winds carried it outward, spreading across seas and continents, until half the world was touched by its weight. Over South Asia, the skies opened and grey snow began to fall. Not snow of ice, but of pulverized stone, tiny shards, sharp as glass, drifting down in endless storms. They piled on riverbanks, filled valleys, and buried forests. Fields where animals once grazed vanished beneath meters of lifeless dust. Streams clogged, their waters choked until fish gasped and died beneath the surface. The land itself became suffocated under a blanket of ash. In India, the fallout was catastrophic. Archaeological sites reveal layers of volcanic ash meters, thick, an unmistakable signature of Toba's reach. Entire ecosystems collapsed under that weight. Plants withered, their leaves coated until photosynthesis stopped. Grazing animals starved, their bones left scattered in the grey. And with them, the hunters who depended on those herds found their own survival cut short. Imagine being part of a small band wandering these lands. For days you walk, searching for signs of life, but everywhere the ground is silent. The horizon is dim with haze. You kneel to dig at the earth, hoping to find tubers, but your fingers come away coated in grit. The children grow thin, their eyes sunken, their voices quiet. The elders mutter about times when the rains fed the land, when grass reached higher than the knee, when herds darkened the horizon. Now there is only silence, only dust. This was not confined to South Asia. Across the world, temperatures fell. Without sunlight, the earth cooled rapidly. Ice expanded from the poles, creeping down into latitudes that had never known such cold. Even in Africa, once a refuge of warmth, nights grew bitter, and mornings were rimmed with frost. The winds shifted, carrying storms across regions unprepared for them. Rain patterns faltered. Where there had been fertile valleys, there came drought. Where rivers once flowed, they shrank to bitter streams fouled with ash. The fallout reached into every corner of the web of life. Crops, what primitive plants humans relied upon, failed to bear fruit. Berries shriveled before ripening. Nuts fell too soon. Empty shells that cracked open to reveal nothing. Roots turned bitter, their growth stunted. Entire food chains unraveled. The grazers died, and with them the predators starved. Wolves and lions, stripped of prey, turned to desperation, scavenging what they could, sometimes daring to stalk humans who were equally desperate. Speculation allows us to linger in these moments, to feel the weight of them not as data points, but as lived experience. Imagine watching the last of a herd collapse, ribs jutting, eyes glazed, its breath shallow against the frost. Imagine hearing your stomach echo with hunger, the emptiness stretching, day after day. Perhaps you search the ash for insects, or strip bark from trees, chewing fibrous strands that offer no nourishment. Perhaps you begin to eat things once unthinkable, decayed flesh, the bones of the dead cracked open for marrow. The global fallout was not a single event, but a cascade. One collapse led to another. Plants died, animals followed, humans were left stranded. The climate, already unstable, tipped further toward ice. Scientists studying the record find evidence of decades-long cooling, enough to trigger what some call a volcanic winter that lasted perhaps 1,000 years. For humans alive then, this was not measured in centuries. It was measured in days without food, nights without warmth, seasons that never returned to normal. And yet the earth itself was not silent. As the ash circled the globe, it painted the skies with eerie colors. Even in distant lands, sunsets became blood red, and the stars vanished behind veils of haze. Perhaps some survivors looked upward in awe, mistaking the spectacle for omens, stories written across the sky. Perhaps they whispered that the world was ending, or that it was being remade. For them, science could not explain it. Only myth could carry its weight. But the physical toll was inescapable. The ash that fell into lungs caused sickness, coughing fits, fevers, the slow suffocation of those too young or too old to withstand it. Water sources became poisoned, leaving tribes to choose between thirst and illness. Animals that could have been hunted lay dead from starvation or disease, their carcasses tainted, dangerous to eat. Each choice narrowed, each day pressed harder. In South Asia, the ashfall was so thick that sunlight never touched the ground for months. Archaeologists studying soil samples see the stark boundary between life and silence, fertile layers smothered beneath sterile gray. It is not difficult to imagine whole groups disappearing here, their fires extinguished, their voices silenced forever. And yet, humanity did not vanish entirely. There were places where the fallout was thinner, where rivers still ran, where plants still grew in pockets sheltered from the worst. These became refuges, fragile oases amid the devastation. Tribes may have gathered in these zones, strangers meeting strangers, bound by necessity. Perhaps for the first time, groups who once wandered apart came together, finding in cooperation the only path forward. But even in those safe havens, the air was colder, the food scarcer, the nights longer. Every decision carried the weight of survival. To hunt meant risking injury in a world with no healing but rest. To travel meant leaving behind the safety of fire. To stay meant watching supplies dwindle. The balance was precarious, fragile as the ash drifting from the sky. Speculation lets us feel the psychological toll. What stories were told in those nights of hunger? Did they whisper of angry mountains, of gods hidden in the smoke, of a world punished for unknown sins? Did they comfort their children with promises of the sun's return, even as they doubted it themselves? And how many, as the months stretched into years, began to wonder if the world had ended already, if this twilight was all that would remain? The global fallout was not just a test of the Earth's resilience, but of humanity's. Every human alive today descends from those who faced it. Their endurance, through hunger, through cold, through endless twilight, is the reason we are here at all. But to truly understand the depth of their trial, we must step deeper into the long winter that followed, a winter not of seasons, but of decades, when survival became not just difficult, but nearly impossible. The cold did not come all at once. It crept in slowly, each night a little sharper, each dawn a little thinner with frost. What began as a dimming of light became a dimming of warmth, until entire seasons shifted and the world was bound in an unfamiliar chill. Across the globe, winter extended its reach, not for a year or two, but for decades. It was a volcanic ice age, a season without end. Imagine waking beneath that sky. The horizon glows faintly red at noon, as though the sun itself is bleeding through ash. The air stings with cold, even in lands that once baked under heat. Frost spreads over grasses, coating them in white filigree. Rivers freeze in places where they should run free. The nights grow longer, darker, so absolute that firelight feels like a fragile secret against an overwhelming void. For humans, every day became a fight to see the next sunrise, though sunrise itself no longer promised warmth. In East Africa, where warmth had once been a constant ally, the air turned treacherous. Winds carried a sharp bite, nights left hunters shivering even within shelters. Animals that had survived the first waves of ash began to vanish. Grazing herds, once the heartbeat of the plains, dwindled until the land seemed empty. Predators disappeared too, unable to sustain themselves without prey. The great chain of life was unraveling, link by link, and humans stood at its frayed edge. Farther north, in Asia and Europe, the winter was harsher still. There glaciers expanded, pushing southward like walls of ice. Valleys filled with snow that never melted. Forests cracked and groaned beneath the weight of ice. Even Neanderthals, built for the cold, would have faced trials beyond measure. Their stocky frames, adapted to glacial winds, may have bought them time, but even their strength could not conjure food from frozen earth. For Homo sapiens, whose numbers were already few, this was more than hardship. It was a narrowing of possibility. Populations shrank to tiny clusters, isolated in pockets where the cold was less severe, where food could still be found. Some geneticists suggest that all of humanity may have been reduced to as few as 2,000 or 3,000 breeding individuals, a number small enough to stand on a single hillside, small enough to vanish entirely with one stroke of bad fortune. Speculation allows us to see this more closely, to imagine the rhythms of life under such conditions. A band of 20 gathers in a cave, their fire burning low. Outside, the wind howls, carrying with it fine ash that stings the eyes. Inside, bodies huddle together for warmth. The hunters return with little more than scraps, a rabbit, a few roots pried from the hard earth. These are shared evenly, each bite small, each mouthful swallowed in silence. A child whimpers with hunger, soothed not by food, but by the warmth of a mother's arms. The elders whisper to one another, wondering how much longer this can last. And always, beyond the cave mouth, the darkness presses close, endless and unbroken. It is easy for us to think of survival as an instinct, something automatic. But in this long winter, survival was a conscious choice, renewed each morning. Do we stay and risk starvation, or do we move and risk the cold? Do we hunt the last of the animals here, or do we let them go, hoping they breed again in spring? Every decision carried consequences, and every mistake could end not just one life, but the survival of an entire band. And yet, within this struggle, there was resilience. Humans learned to use fire not just for warmth, but for endurance. They carried embers with them as they moved, cradled in bark or wrapped in moss, so that flame was never lost. They turned to foods they had once ignored, roots bitter with toxins, insects found beneath stones, marrow sucked from brittle bones. They sharpened their tools, made clothing from hides, layered against the cold. They learned, adapted, endured. Still the cost was immense. Imagine how silence must have deepened across the world. Songs and laughter faded, replaced by the quiet of hunger. Many tribes must have vanished, their names lost, their stories extinguished with the last flicker of their fire. When we look into our own DNA today, we see not only the survival of our ancestors, but the absence of countless others. Entire lineages gone, erased in this winter, leaving behind only ghosts. The psychological toll must have been profound. For humans who had always trusted in the cycles of nature, the return of the rains, the warmth of the sun, this endless winter would have felt like betrayal. Perhaps they began to believe that the world itself was dying. Perhaps they saw the ash and cold as punishment from forces beyond their understanding. Around fires, stories must have grown, myths of a sky swallowed by smoke, of a sun that abandoned the earth. These stories, shaped in desperation, may have echoed forward into the myths of later civilizations, faint memories of a winter that nearly ended everything. And yet, even in this frozen dark, life went on. Mothers bore children, though many did not survive. Hunters still left the caves, their spears heavy in their hands, chasing faint tracks in the snow. Fires still burned, their smoke curling upward into skies that gave nothing back. Each day lived was a victory. Each sunrise seen was a triumph against odds that seemed insurmountable. Scientists debate how long this volcanic winter lasted. Some say a few decades of deep cold, others argue for centuries of chill. Either way, for those who lived it, the distinction was meaningless. Time was not measured in years, but in seasons of hunger, in the survival of each generation, in the fragile continuation of life. Speculation lets us wonder, what if one tribe, one night, had failed to keep the fire alive? What if a drought had lasted a season longer, or a storm had taken the last of the hunters? Would humanity have ended there, our story silenced before it began? The margin was that narrow, our survival balanced on a knife's edge, sharpened by ash and ice, and yet, against all odds, we endured. The long winter tested us, stripped us down to our most fragile selves, and still we survived. When the skies at last began to clear, when the light returned and warmth seeped slowly back into the earth, there were still humans to greet it, fewer, thinner, scarred by loss, but alive. It is humbling to think of it, that every human alive today descends from those who faced this volcanic night, that their struggle, their persistence carried forward into us, that the warmth you feel on your skin now, the breath you take in the light of the sun, is possible only because they endured the darkness. But survival was never inevitable. It was earned day by day, in caves and forests, in silence and hunger. The long winter did not end us, but it very nearly did. And from this, another question arises. How close did we truly come to vanishing? To answer, we must look into the evidence written, not in myth or memory, but in our very genes, the bottleneck that reveals just how fragile our hold on existence became. The story of the long winter does not end with ash or cold. Its imprint is carried forward in us, in every breath we take, in every strand of our DNA. When scientists look deeply into the code of our species, they see a strange narrowing, a moment when humanity itself nearly vanished. This is the genetic bottleneck, a signature of survival through catastrophe. Our DNA is like a library, each of us carrying volumes of information passed down through generations. Normally, such a library is vast, filled with countless variations, collected over thousands of years. But in humans, there's a missing richness. Compared to other species, our genetic diversity is shockingly small. 2 chimpanzees, living side by side in a forest today, may carry more genetic differences than 2 humans taken from opposite ends of the earth. The reason is simple. We almost disappeared. The evidence points to a collapse in our population around 74,000 years ago, the very time of Toba's eruption. Models suggest humanity may have been reduced to as few as 2,000 or 3,000 breeding individuals. Imagine that. The entire species, scattered across Africa and Asia, narrowed down to the size of a single village. One illness, one drought, one failed migration could have erased us entirely. Yet, against all odds, those few carried the weight of the future. Speculation allows us to picture them, not as faceless survivors, but as people. Perhaps a band huddled in the highlands of Ethiopia, sheltering in caves warmed by fire. Perhaps another clung to the coasts of India, gathering shellfish from waters where life still endured. Another may have survived in the forests of Southeast Asia, hidden in pockets untouched by the worst of the ash. Each group small, fragile, unknowing that they alone bore the destiny of our species. In those times, survival meant more than strength. It meant adaptability. The bottleneck may have favored qualities that became hallmarks of our species: cooperation, innovation, the ability to endure scarcity. When numbers are so small, chance alone can shape the future. A few families, a handful of children, may have carried forward traits that would define humanity forever. Perhaps the persistence of firekeeping, the sharing of food, or the weaving of early language became not just traditions, but necessities that determined survival. The genetic record tells us something profound, that we are all more alike than we realize. Beneath the surface of culture and geography, our shared ancestry is recent, bound to those few who survived. Every human alive today can trace their lineage back to the same narrow thread of existence. We are kin not in metaphor, but in biology. Imagine standing in that time. You belong to one of the few surviving bands. You know hunger, cold, and fear. You know the absence of animals that once roamed the plains, the silence of forests where birds no longer sing. Yet you also know firelight, the warmth of others pressed close, the rhythm of footsteps as the band moves together in search of food. What you do not know is that your survival carries the weight of millennia, that thousands of generations yet to come depend on your endurance. The bottleneck was not just biological, it was cultural. Knowledge passed down became all the more precious because so few remained to carry it. If one elder died, a lifetime of wisdom might be lost. If one hunter fell, the techniques of tracking or tool making could vanish. Stories, songs, and skills were fragile threads stretched thin across the abyss of extinction, yet enough were preserved to carry us forward. Scientists debate the exact numbers, the exact regions, but the conclusion is clear. Humanity walked a razor's edge. At no other point in our history have we been so close to vanishing. Other human species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, also faced trials, but none were reduced as we were, none carried such a narrow passage of survival. And yet, it is precisely because of this bottleneck that we are here. Proof of catastrophe, but also proof of endurance. Speculation invites us to wonder what it felt like to be one of those few. Did they sense their rarity? Did they look at the empty landscapes and understand that something vast had been lost? Or did they simply live one day to the next, unknowing that history itself balanced on their shoulders? Perhaps survival was not framed as destiny, but as necessity. A fire kept alive not for the future, but for the night at hand. And yet we can see the result. From those few came billions. From those fragile bands came art, language, cities, and science. The genetic bottleneck is a reminder that fragility can give birth to resilience, that scarcity can forge strength. But it also leaves us with a haunting thought. If our population once fell so low, what was lost? How many families, lineages, songs, and traditions vanished forever in that narrowing? The bottleneck preserved humanity, but it erased countless others. We are descendants not only of survivors, but of silence. This is the paradox of the bottleneck. It proves our survival, but it also proves how close we came to extinction. And it raises another question. If our numbers were so few, if survival was so precarious, what would have happened had the world delivered one more blow? One more drought, one more famine, one more storm. Would we be here at all? To explore that, we must step into the next chapter. A world on the edge, where survival was not inevitable, and humanity lived each day as though it might be the last. In the aftermath of Toba's fury, the world teetered on a knife's edge. Every human who walked the earth then lived under the weight of uncertainty. The skies were dim, the air colder, the ground brittle with ash. Food was scarce, water often bitter, and the horizon offered no promises. Humanity existed not in strength, but in fragility. We were one drought, one famine, one storm away from vanishing altogether. Imagine yourself as one of those few survivors. Each morning you wake to a world that feels smaller, emptier. The animals you once hunted have grown rare, their herds thinned to shadows. Plants that once offered roots or berries now wither beneath pale skies. Every choice becomes sharpened by consequence. If you walk too far in search of food, you may never return. If you stay too long in one place, you may starve. The balance is so fine that survival itself feels accidental, as though the earth is testing you, waiting for one mistake. This was not an imagined fear. The genetic record shows how close we came to disappearance. With only a few thousand individuals left, our species had no margin for error. A disease spreading among one band could have erased an entire lineage. A storm flooding a valley could have drowned a tribe that carried generations of memory. A drought could have ended a cluster of families who knew the secrets of plants and animals in that region. Every human life mattered, not as an idea, but as a tangible thread holding together the fabric of survival. Speculation lets us see this in sharper detail. A band gathers at the mouth of a cave, watching the sky for signs of weather. Clouds form, heavy with ash, and the hunters debate whether to travel. They know prey is scarce nearby, but if they move too far, the youngest may not endure the cold. A single decision, whether to stay or go, could shape not only their future, but the future of every descendant they might one day have. Perhaps they chose to stay, and hunger hollowed them out. Perhaps they chose to go, and one child survived, carrying forward a spark of life that would ripple across millennia until it reached you. Our survival was not inevitable. It was fragile, conditional, dependent on chance as much as on skill. Even the smallest misfortune could have tipped the balance. A broken leg, a failed fire, a storm that swept away a shelter, all could spell the end for a band already pressed to its limits. When numbers are that small, extinction does not arrive as a cataclysmic event. It arrives quietly, tribe by tribe, until silence remains. And yet, in this precarious world, humans adapted. They sought out refuges, pockets of land where climate and food still allowed life. East Africa may have been one such haven, its lakes and valleys offering sustenance even in the dimmed skies. Coastal regions provided shellfish and seaweed, resources less vulnerable to the failures of land. Forests, though diminished, still hid roots and small game. These zones became lifelines, the narrow corridors through which humanity threaded its survival. But even within these havens, life was not secure. The ash in the air dimmed the sun and cooled the earth. Plants grew slowly, animals reproduced less frequently, and famine was always near. Imagine sitting by a fire in such a place, listening to the crackle of wood as the elders speak of times when the earth was warmer, when rivers flowed full, when herds were plentiful. Their stories are not myth but memory, and yet to the children listening, those tales must have sounded like legends of another world. This sense of living on the edge likely shaped the psychology of our species. Survival demanded cooperation, but it also demanded vigilance. Every sound in the night could mean danger. Every stranger encountered could mean competition for dwindling food. Violence and unity must have walked hand in hand. Some bands perished through conflict, while others endured through alliance. To live in that time was to live with the constant awareness that extinction was close enough to touch. The scientific record gives us numbers, but it does not give us voices. For that we must imagine. Did the survivors dream of warmth returning, of skies clearing, of herds darkening the plains once more? Or did they accept the twilight as permanent, shaping their lives around it, teaching their children not of what was lost, but of what remained? Perhaps in whispers they told both kinds of stories, hope and resignation woven together like the strands of rope that bound their shelters. What makes this chapter extraordinary is not that we survived, but that survival was possible at all. The world on the edge was unforgiving, indifferent to whether humans endured. And yet endurance happened. Through fire, through cold, through famine and storm, a fragile handful of our ancestors carried life forward. Speculation raises a haunting question. What if they had not? What if one more disaster had struck, another eruption, another ice surge, another shift in the climate? Would Earth today be home to other humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, perhaps a species yet unnamed, while our own line existed only as a fossilized memory? What if we were never meant to survive, and yet we did? The answer remains in the fact of our existence. We are here, breathing air, once choked by ash, walking on lands once buried in grey. But our survival was never guaranteed. It was won by persistence, by chance, by decisions made around firelight thousands of generations ago. This recognition carries a weight. To know that every heartbeat now descends from those who lived in a world on the edge is to feel both gratitude and humility. We are not here because survival was certain. We are here because a fragile few endured when the odds demanded otherwise, and that endurance leads us forward, into the next shadow of this story, the hunger that spread when ash poisoned the land, when plants withered and animals collapsed, and when survival meant making choices more desperate than any before. Hunger was the shadow that followed the ash. It crept into every camp, every shelter, every breath of the volcanic winter. When the skies dimmed and the earth cooled, photosynthesis faltered. Plants, the foundation of all life, could not thrive beneath a sun that no longer gave it strength. Leaves yellowed and shriveled before their time. Roots grew stunted, brittle beneath the soil. Fruits once swollen with sweetness failed to ripen, falling to the ground as hollow shells. The green pulse of the earth slowed, and with it the promise of food. Imagine standing on a plain where grass once waved high, where antelope once grazed in their thousands. Now the horizon is grey and silent. The grasses are pale and brittle, breaking at the touch. The herds are gone, their tracks fading into dust. You kneel to pull a root from the soil, only to find it thin, bitter, its flesh offering no nourishment. The children behind you watch, their eyes expectant, but there's nothing to give them. Hunger begins not as an emptiness in the stomach, but as a silence in the land, the absence of life where life once thrived. Starvation spread like fire across the scattered tribes of humanity. Without plants, the herbivores suffered first. Their bodies weakened, their herds thinned, and soon their bones littered the ashen ground. With them went the predators, lions, leopards, wolves, once fierce hunters, now emaciated, scavenging scraps where none remained. And when the animals collapsed, the humans who depended on them faced their own reckoning. For the hunter returning to camp with an empty hand, hunger was not abstract. It was a child's quiet whimper, an elder's fading strength, the sight of bones beneath skin. Tribes shared what little they had, but sharing only spread the hunger evenly. No one was spared. Speculation lets us linger in the moments this hunger created. Picture a band gathered at dusk, firelight flickering against faces hollowed by famine. They divide what remains, a handful of roots, a strip of dried meat. The portions are small, almost symbolic. Mothers pass their share to children. Elders press food into the hands of the young, knowing their own strength is fading. Conversations are quiet because words cost energy, and energy must be saved. The silence of hunger is heavier than the silence of night. The collapse of animal populations made hunting nearly impossible. Trails once fresh with prints grew empty. Hunters followed tracks for days only to find carcasses. Animals dead not by spear but by starvation. Each failed hunt was more than wasted effort. It was lost time, lost strength, another step closer to collapse. Some turned to smaller prey, rodents, birds, insects. But these too dwindled under the strain of a broken food chain. The balance of life had tipped, and nothing escaped its fall. Plants, once dependable, became unreliable. The ash that coated leaves blocked sunlight. The soils, poisoned by sulfur and choked with dust, refused to yield crops. Even wild grains, which humans had gathered long before they learned to plant, failed to grow. The land that had always provided now betrayed its caretakers. The psychological toll was as deep as the physical. For humans whose lives revolved around the search for food, the failure of the land and animals was more than hardship. It was a breaking of trust. The rhythms of nature, once steady, now seemed chaotic and hostile. Perhaps tribes whispered that the world was ending, that the gods of mountain and sky had turned against them. Perhaps some held to hope, insisting the sun would return, the plants would grow, the herds would rise again. But for many, hope grew as thin as the bodies around the fire. Scientific evidence supports this vision. Layers of ash across India and Southeast Asia reveal environments stripped bare. Fossilized remains show mass die-offs of animals, ecosystems collapsing in unison. The genetic bottleneck tells the rest. Entire groups of humans, unable to withstand famine, vanished without trace. Only a few, scattered in regions where conditions were less severe, managed to endure. Speculation brings us closer to those survivors. Imagine a group on the coast turning to the sea when the land failed them. Shellfish, seaweed, fish pulled from shallow waters, these became lifelines when grazing animals disappeared. Perhaps they learned to dig deeper for roots, to chew bark, to eat insects they once ignored. Hunger stripped away choice, leaving only necessity. The question was no longer what to eat, but whether anything could be eaten at all. The hunger shaped every decision. It pushed tribes into conflict, competing for scraps of land where food still grew. It drove migrations, long journeys in search of places untouched by ash. It demanded sacrifices, elders giving up food for the young, hunters risking death for uncertain reward. It blurred the line between survival and desperation. And yet, hunger also taught resilience. It forced humans to experiment, to innovate. Perhaps they discovered new ways to cook bitter roots to make them edible. Perhaps they learned to store food more carefully, rationing with discipline. Perhaps, in the long nights of famine, they shared not just food but comfort, songs, stories, reassurances that tomorrow might still bring something better. Still, for many, tomorrow brought only more hunger. The skeletal remains of tribes who did not survive would have been left unmarked, their bones scattered by wind and scavengers, their names lost to time. They are the silent majority of our ancestors, the ones who did not endure. We, the living, are descended only from the exceptions, from those who found some way, however fragile, to carry life forward. This chapter of ash and hunger leaves us with an image both stark and humbling. A small group huddled around a dwindling fire. Their bodies are thin, their faces drawn, but their eyes still reflect the glow of determination. Around them, the land is barren, silent, covered in gray. Above them the sky is dark, the sun no more than a memory, yet in their hunger, in their struggle, lies the thread of humanity's survival. And so the question lingers. When the land offers nothing, when animals die and plants wither, what does a species do to endure? To answer, we must look into the choices made in desperation, the scavenger's choice, where survival meant eating whatever remained, no matter how unthinkable. When hunger deepens beyond endurance, survival becomes a matter not of preference but of desperation. In the shadow of Toba's eruption, with plants withered and animals gone, humanity was forced into choices that stripped life down to its rawest essence. To live meant eating whatever remained, roots bitter with toxins, insects hiding in the cracks of stone, carrion left behind by predators equally desperate. It was not abundance that carried us forward, but desperation sharpened into resilience. Imagine kneeling in the ash, clawing at the soil with bare hands, searching for something to chew. You find a tuber, thin and foul-smelling, its skin blackened by poisoned earth. It is not food as you once knew it, but it fills the stomach for a time. Or picture lifting a stone and finding insects scattering beneath, their bodies writhing in the dim light. You pluck them quickly, swallow them whole, ignoring the taste, the crunch, the revulsion. Hunger teaches that nourishment is not about choice, it is about survival. Speculation lets us enter those moments more closely. A child cries through the night, stomach empty, voice raw. A mother quiets them with a handful of grubs gathered from rotting wood. The child eats reluctantly at first, then desperately, the sound of chewing loud in the silence. An elder, too weak to move, gnaws marrow from the bone of a deer that starved weeks before, the flesh long gone, the smell rancid. Fire crackles nearby, not to cook but to warm the frozen hands of those who will rise again tomorrow to search for more scraps. Archaeological evidence hints at such desperation. Bones from prehistoric sites show signs of being cracked open, marrow extracted with precision. Tools were shaped not only for hunting but for scraping, splitting, prying, signs of scavenging as much as of hunting. Some suggest that in these years humanity turned more fully to the ocean's edge, eating shellfish, crabs, seaweed, creatures less dependent on sunlight and grass. In the depths of famine, the shore became salvation. Yet even there, desperation shaped behavior. Coastal bands may have eaten things once avoided. Jellyfish washed ashore, rotting carcasses of seals, fish left stranded by the tide. Inland, others turned to rodents, insects, reptiles, any creature small enough to be caught, large enough to offer a moment's reprieve from hunger. It was a diet of necessity, and it bound survival to ingenuity. But there was also a darker side. The scavenger's choice could mean carrion, flesh already claimed by death. Imagine stumbling upon the body of an aurochs, ribs jutting, eyes clouded. Flies swarm, the air thick with stench. Hunger pushes you forward, hand gripping a stone tool. You cut through rotting flesh, gagging at the taste but eating nonetheless. You do not ask whether it is safe. You ask only whether it will keep you alive until tomorrow. Perhaps even more haunting, some speculate that in the most desperate corners of this volcanic winter, humans may have turned to one another. Anthropological records from later famines show that cannibalism has appeared in times of collapse. Could it have happened then, when survival narrowed to its thinnest edge? It is a question without evidence, but one that lingers at the edge of imagination. What is certain is that desperation left little room for choice. Still, within this bleakness, resilience glimmered. The scavenger's diet may have been meager, but it taught flexibility. Insects, roots, shellfish, marrow, these became part of the human palate, and perhaps part of the adaptability that defines us still. Where other species starved when their preferred food vanished, humans expanded their options, reshaped their habits, endured. Speculation allows us to see not just the act of eating, but the culture that may have grown around it. Perhaps elders taught children how to find edible grubs, how to crack open bones without wasting the marrow. Perhaps songs were sung not of abundance but of endurance, songs that reminded the band that even scraps were enough to see another day. Hunger did not erase community. If anything, it made it more essential. Picture a group at dusk gathered around a fire. A few roots are passed around, roasted to soften their bitterness. A handful of insects are shared one by one. No one eats their fill, but everyone eats something. The firelight reflects in eyes tired with hunger, but alive with determination. They do not know that they are carrying the species forward. They know only that they are carrying themselves, the children, their kin, through one more night. The scavenger's choice was more than desperation, it was adaptation. It meant redefining food, reshaping behavior, expanding survival strategies to include the unthinkable. And in that expansion lay the thread of continuity. Without it, the line would have snapped. With it, humanity endured. Yet even as they endured, the question remained, how long could this last? Hunger gnawed at the body and the spirit alike. Each meal was temporary, each choice precarious. Survival was never secure, only extended by fragments, scraps, and chance. The image that lingers is haunting, a handful of figures moving across a grey landscape, eyes scanning the ground for anything that can be eaten. Behind them silence stretches, the silence of vanished tribes, extinct animals, empty forests. Ahead of them lies only uncertainty, and yet, step by step, bite by bite, they move forward. This is the legacy of the scavenger's choice. That humanity clung to life in desperation, and in doing so proved that even in the harshest winters, the will to survive can turn scraps into sustenance, ashes into endurance. And from this endurance rises another question. Where did humanity find refuge? Were there places in this shattered world where life still flourished, where ash and hunger did not fully take hold? To answer, we must follow the path of survivors into the few remaining zones of safety, the rare oases where life, fragile as it was, could still be sustained. Even in a world smothered by ash and silenced by hunger, there were pockets of life that endured. Scattered across the continents, hidden in the folds of geography and chance, a few regions remained livable. They were not abundant, not lush paradises, but they offered just enough. Oases of survival amid global ruin, places where humanity gathered, fragile clusters of life holding on against the overwhelming dark. Evidence suggests that East Africa was one of these havens. The valleys of the rift, with their deep lakes and shifting climates, may have buffered against the worst of the volcanic winter. There, waters still held fish, reeds still sheltered birds, and the land, though colder, still offered roots and wild grains that clung to life even beneath a dimmed sun. Imagine standing at the edge of Lake Malawi or Lake Tanganyika in those days. The horizon grey, the air sharp, but the waters before you alive with movement, a school of fish flashing beneath the surface, a bird wheeling overhead, wings spread wide. In a world that felt emptied, these signs of life must have been salvation. South Asia, too, bears the scars of Toba's ash, but within the devastation there may have been refuges. Along coastlines, the ocean offered resources that land could not. Shellfish, crabs, seaweed, fish washed ashore with the tides. Archaeological traces in India suggest continuity of human presence, even through the eruption's aftermath. Perhaps tribes clustered along estuaries, learning to depend on the sea when the land betrayed them. The shoreline, shifting and dangerous, became a corridor of survival. In Southeast Asia, the story may have been similar. While Toba's fury was greatest there, not every valley, not every island was obliterated. Some regions, shielded by winds or distance, escaped the deepest layers of ash. There plants grew more readily, animals endured longer, and humans found pockets of sustenance. These islands of survival, though scattered, formed stepping stones through the darkness. Speculation lets us imagine what life in these refuges felt like. You are part of a small band camped by the shore of East Africa. Each morning, the hunters cast nets or sharpened spears, moving into the water to catch fish. Gatherers search the shallows for clams, their hands numbed by cold but rewarded with food. Children carry reeds back to camp, weaving them into mats or kindling for fire. The meals are meager, but they are meals. Hunger lingers, but it's not death. Hope flickers with each successful catch, each handful of shellfish pried from the sand. These havens were not large enough to hold all of humanity. They were narrow corridors, fragile sanctuaries where numbers clustered tightly. Tribes that once wandered freely may have found themselves pressed together. Strangers meeting strangers, drawn by the same need for safety. This closeness could spark tension, fights over fishing grounds, quarrels over hunting trails, but it could also spark cooperation. In the face of shared desperation, new alliances may have formed, groups merging to increase their odds of survival. The genetic record hints at this clustering. Humanity's reduced diversity suggests that many lineages vanished, while a few concentrated groups endured. In these refuges, the survivors intermarried, their children carrying forward the narrow thread of ancestry that unites us all today. The valleys of East Africa, the coasts of India, the scattered islands of Southeast Asia, these places were more than refuges. They were crucibles where the future of humanity was forged. Speculation extends further. Imagine two bands meeting by chance at a riverbank in Africa. Each has lost members, each is thin with hunger. At first they approach with caution, spears raised, wary of strangers, but then a fish is caught and the groups share the meal. The children play together, laughter breaking the silence of famine. Slowly bonds form, stories are exchanged, knowledge is traded, where roots can still be found, how to keep fire alive in the rain. Out of necessity kinship is born, and in that kinship lies survival. Not every refuge was equal. Some may have lasted longer, others may have collapsed under the weight of too many mouths. Imagine a coastal camp where the shellfish beds grow empty, stripped bare by desperate hands. The tribe moves on, searching for another shore, leaving behind only ashes of their fires. Another group, deeper inland, digs roots from soil that grows thinner each season. When famine claims them, their story ends in silence. Only the successful clusters, balanced precariously on the edge of abundance and scarcity, managed to endure. The landscapes themselves must have felt transformed. Valleys once lush, now muted beneath ash, rivers running sluggish, carrying silt from poisoned lands, coasts battered by storms, their tides unpredictable. Survivors walked through worlds they no longer recognized, landscapes familiar yet alien. The refuges were not paradises, they were simply less lethal than everywhere else. What must it have felt like to know that safety was not permanent, that even in the best places food was scarce and death was never far? Perhaps humans learned not to trust abundance, not to assume the land would always provide. Perhaps this seeded a mindset of caution, of preparation, of innovation, a psychology shaped by scarcity, passed down through generations. The memory of nearly losing everything may have lingered long after the skies cleared. Scientists call these places refugia, but for the survivors they were more than ecological zones. They were hope embodied. Each fish pulled from the water, each root dug from the soil, was a reminder that life could continue, that the species could endure. In the darkest of ages, these small havens carried the flame of humanity forward. Speculation allows us one more vision. A band stands at the edge of a lake in East Africa. The air is cool, the sky still dim, but the water before them shimmers with fish. They cast their nets, and when the catch comes in, there's food for the night. They light a fire, the smoke rising against the ashen sky. Children eat, elders rest, and for a moment the fear recedes. Around that fire, humanity holds on, not through conquest or strength, but through the fragile persistence of refuge. And so, we see that even amid devastation, the earth offered a few sanctuaries, small, scattered, fragile, but enough. It was in these refuges that humanity clustered, endured, and prepared to face the unending cold. But survival in these zones demanded more than food. It demanded protection, shelter, and the shared warmth of fire. To understand how humans endured the endless night, we must step inside the shelters where they huddled, bound together against the dark. Survival in the refuges was never simply a matter of food. It was also a matter of warmth, of safety, of holding the night at bay. In a world plunged into cold and twilight, Humans learned that their greatest defense was not strength alone, but shelter and fire, fragile fortresses against the endless winter. Picture a band gathered at the mouth of a cave, the ground outside coated in frost, though the land lies in Africa, a place once warm and familiar. Inside, a fire glows, its light dancing on stone walls. The smoke drifts upward into the cracks, leaving the air heavy but survivable. Bodies press close together, not from affection alone, but from necessity. Warmth is shared skin to skin, firelight stretching just far enough to keep the shadows from swallowing them. This is not comfort, it is survival. The shelters of fire were more than physical structures. They were symbols of endurance. Caves provided protection from wind and predators, a barrier against storms that swept the land. Fire offered warmth, a tool for cooking, a defense against the dark. To lose fire in those years was to risk death. For this reason, embers were carried like treasure, wrapped in moss or bark, transported carefully from place to place. Fire was not simply light. It was life cradled in fragile hands. Speculation lets us imagine what it meant to huddle through those nights. The cave is crowded, the walls echoing with coughs from ash-filled lungs. The fire crackles low, its fuel gathered carefully by those who risked the cold to find branches. Around it, children curl against their mothers, their breath visible in the chill air. Elders sit close to the flames, whispering stories to distract from the growl of stomachs. Outside the wind howls, carrying ash and ice, but inside there is a fragile pocket of survival. Archaeological evidence speaks of such shelters. Caves in Africa, India, and Southeast Asia bear traces of fire pits, stone tools, and pigments used even in those desperate times. These places were not grand halls of security, but small enclaves where humans endured the unendurable. Each flicker of fire on cave walls was a reminder that life persisted, that humanity had not been extinguished. The cooperation within these shelters was as vital as the fire itself. In times of abundance, groups could splinter, wander apart. But in times of scarcity, unity was the only hope. A single hunter could not feed a tribe. A single gatherer could not keep the fire alive. Each role mattered, the forager who returned with bitter roots, the hunter who risked injury for scraps of meat, the elder who remembered where water could still be found. Even children played a part, gathering reeds or carrying embers. Survival was not individual, it was communal. Speculation paints scenes of this cooperation. Imagine two families, once strangers, forced together in the same cave. At first there is tension, suspicion, guarded glances, but hunger presses them into alliance. They share fire, they share food, they share stories. Slowly bonds form. A child from one family laughs at the tale told by an elder of another. A hunter teaches a technique to a stranger. In these moments, survival expands beyond bloodlines. Humanity learns that kinship can be chosen, that alliances can be forged in firelight. Fire itself became more than warmth. It was a ritual. To gather around it was to affirm life, to push back against the overwhelming dark. Perhaps songs were sung in its glow, chants to steady the spirit. Perhaps marks were drawn on cave walls, images of animals and shapes, a way of remembering life beyond hunger. Even in famine, even in cold, humans carried the impulse to create. Firelight did not only warm the body, it stirred the mind, and yet the fragility of this existence cannot be overstated. Fire demanded fuel, and fuel demanded risk. In a world stripped bare, each branch was precious. To venture out into the cold in search of wood was to gamble with death. A storm might strike, a predator might linger, the ash might choke. Yet without fuel the fire would die, and with it the fragile warmth that sustained the tribe. Each ember was both a toll and a burden, a reminder of how precarious survival truly was. The shelters themselves varied. Some were caves, deep and protective. Others were huts of branches and hides, lashed together against the wind. In coastal refuges, shelters may have been made from reeds and driftwood, fragile but functional. Whatever their form, their purpose was the same: to gather the living close, to concentrate heat, to create a boundary between life and the frozen dark beyond. Speculation lets us step inside one of these shelters on a night of deepest winter. The fire is low, the smoke thick, ash drifts in through cracks, settling on hair and skin. The youngest whimper, too cold to sleep. A mother rocks her child, humming softly. A hunter, injured from a failed chase, lies near the fire, his leg bound with strips of hide. An elder sits awake, watching the flames, knowing that if the fire dies, so too will those around it. Outside, snow falls silently on a land that has forgotten warmth. Inside, the tribe endures, one flicker of flame at a time. This reliance on shelter and fire may have reshaped humanity's path. Cooperation, ritual, memory, all were bound to these enclosed spaces. Here, language deepened. Here, knowledge was preserved. Here, the bonds that turned survival into culture were forged. The shelters of fire were more than refuges. They were classrooms, sanctuaries, wombs of human identity. But they were also fragile. One misstep, one fire left untended, one shelter swept away by storm, one quarrel that fractured unity, and survival could end. Every tribe knew that they were always one night away from extinction. That knowledge must have weighed heavily, shaping caution, shaping humility, shaping the stories passed down. In the end, it was not strength that preserved humanity in these years, but cooperation within these shelters of fire. The caves, the huts, the fire pits, they were small, fragile, and fleeting. Yet within them humanity endured, and from this endurance another shadow emerges, for not all groups could coexist peacefully. In the shrinking world of scarcity, the shelters of fire became both sanctuaries and targets. To understand the full depth of this trial, we must step into the darkness of rivalry, where survival sometimes meant conflict and humanity turned against itself in the long night. When resources dwindled and the world narrowed into fragments of refuge, humanity's greatest danger was no longer only the cold or the ash or the hunger. It was one another. In the long volcanic night, small groups that had once survived in isolation found themselves forced into proximity, their survival strategies overlapping, their shelters uncomfortably close. Fire that once symbolized life also drew the gaze of rivals. Food, already scarce, became reason enough for violence. Rivalry in the dark was as much a part of survival as hunting and foraging. Imagine a band of hunters returning to their shelter with a meager catch, perhaps a half-starved antelope, its flesh barely enough to feed the group. As they light their fire and begin to divide the meat, shadows gather at the edge of the light. Another band has been watching, their own children hungry, their own fires fading. What happens next is not ceremony but necessity. A raid, sudden and violent. Stones hurled, spears thrust, shouts echoing across the darkened plain. In minutes, one group has lost everything, their food taken, their fire scattered, their wounded left behind. Archaeological hints suggest that conflict intensified during periods of scarcity. Fractured skulls, bones scarred by weapons, sites burned rather than abandoned, all whisper of violence sharpened by famine. War in the Paleolithic was not the organized campaigns of later centuries, but bursts of desperate survival. Ambushes in the night, rivalries over hunting grounds or access to water. In an age when every bite of food meant another day alive, the line between cooperation and conflict was razor thin. Speculation brings us closer to the human scale of these rivalries. You are a child in a cave, awakened by the sound of shouting outside. The firelight flickers against the walls, your parents gripping spears as strangers approach. You hear the clash of stone against stone, the scream of a wounded hunter. The air fills with smoke as the fire is disturbed, embers scattering across the floor. When it's over, the victors leave with food and fire, the losers left in silence, the cave colder than before. For you, survival becomes not just about the next hunt, but about whether you can defend what little you have. In these years, violence was not a choice but an outcome of scarcity. When plants withered and animals disappeared, when starvation hollowed the bellies of tribes, desperation drove humans against one another. Even the act of migration, once a natural rhythm, became dangerous. Bands moving into new territories risked confrontation with those already clinging to survival there. Each encounter carried the potential for alliance, but just as often it ended in blood. Yet rivalry was not only about food, it was also about fire. Fire was life, and to lose it meant death. A group unable to spark flame might raid another simply to steal embers. Imagine the terror of waking to find your fire gone, stolen in the night. The cold presses in, the children cry, and you know that unless another ember can be found or taken, your tribe will freeze. Fire, more than food, became the prize of violence. Speculation suggests that such conflicts reshaped humanity. In the crucible of rivalry, groups learned strategies of defense, watching the horizons, guarding fires, setting sentinels at cave mouths. Some may have developed early forms of strategy, choosing high ground for shelters, coordinating attacks, planning raids. Violence, terrible as it was, forced innovation. The skills of war were learned alongside the skills of survival, but rivalry also carried costs. Every death was felt more deeply when numbers were so few. Each fallen hunter meant less food, each slain elder meant lost memory, each child taken or killed meant one less thread in the fragile weave of survival. The genetic bottleneck already reveals how narrow humanity's passage through this era was. Violence may have sharpened the trial further, erasing entire lineages in the dark. Speculation lets us imagine these losses. A tribe of 30 reduced to 20 in a single night. A fire extinguished, leaving survivors to shiver in silence. A mother mourning a child lost not to hunger, but to the spear of another human. These were not grand wars, but intimate tragedies, fought face to face, often among people who might have shared ancestors only a few generations before. In the long night of scarcity, kinship did not prevent conflict. It sharpened it as cousins became rivals over the same meager ground. And yet, even amid rivalry, humanity endured. Some groups chose violence, others chose alliance. The same desperation that led to conflict also led to cooperation. Perhaps two tribes met on the same hunting ground, prepared for war, but instead shared a kill, finding that together they could endure more than apart. Perhaps raids ended not with slaughter, but with absorption, one group merging into another, their stories blending, their bloodlines entwined. In this way, even rivalry became part of the shaping of humanity, winnowing us but also teaching us. The darkness of this time was not only physical but social. Trust was fragile, fear was constant. To sit by a fire was to wonder if another band watched from the shadows, waiting to strike. To hunt was to risk not only the claws of beasts but the spears of other humans. Survival demanded vigilance, courage, and sometimes cruelty. The volcanic winter tested not only bodies but relationships, revealing how thin the line is between cooperation and conflict. And yet, out of this rivalry, new lessons emerged. Humans learned that survival could not rest on violence alone. Too much conflict, too many losses, and a group would collapse. Cooperation, fragile but powerful, became the alternative. The shelters of fire could be targets, but they could also be shared. The long night demanded both rivalry and unity, a balance struck in whispers, in firelight, in blood. This is the paradox of humanity's survival in the dark, that we fought as much as we helped, that our species endured not only through alliance but through struggle. The volcanic winter was not just a test of endurance against the earth. It was a test of endurance against ourselves. And so, the question emerges. In a world where rivalry could destroy, what was it that allowed some groups to choose unity instead? To answer, we must turn to the fragile moments where survival hinged not on conflict, but on cooperation, the choice between unity and death. When the earth was cloaked in ash and famine hollowed the body, there was one truth more unforgiving than the cold. No one survived alone. In that narrow passage of human history, when extinction pressed close, the tribes that endured were not the strongest nor the most violent, but those who learned to bind themselves together. The choice was stark, unity or death. Imagine a small group of 20, their fire sputtering low in the heart of a cave. They have little left, some roots, a handful of insects gathered from bark, a fish caught days ago and stretched into thin strips of dried flesh. Outside, the wind howls, carrying ash that blinds the eyes and burns the lungs. They know they cannot hold on much longer. Then, on the horizon, another fire flickers, another band of humans, no less desperate, no less cold. The first instinct is fear, rivalry sharpened by hunger, but perhaps in the face of annihilation, a different decision is made. Instead of raising spears, they share fire. Instead of fighting for scraps, they divide what little remains. In that fragile moment, an alliance forms, and with it, a chance at survival. The genetic record suggests that cooperation was not just useful, it was decisive. With numbers so low, war could erase a lineage in a single night. But alliances preserved it, allowing knowledge, food, and even bloodlines to flow between groups. Where violence destroyed, cooperation wove continuity. Those who shared endured, those who hoarded perished. Speculation lets us picture these alliances in greater detail. Two tribes meet at a riverbank, each weary, each thin with hunger. They exchange gestures, an offering of food, a shared ember, a song sung across the water. Slowly, barriers fall. They build shelters side by side, their fires burning brighter together. Hunters move out in pairs from different groups, teaching one another techniques. Gatherers share roots where roots still grow, or where shellfish can be found. Children play together, their laughter a rare sound in the silence of famine. In unity, they create something larger than themselves, a community strong enough to resist the darkness. Fire itself became the bond of cooperation. To share fire was to share survival. Perhaps a ritual developed. When two groups met, they touched embers together, blending their flames as a sign of trust. To extinguish another's fire was violence, to sustain it was kinship. Around these flames, humans may have sung together, spoken in the earliest rhythms of language, told stories that wove unity into memory. The choice of unity was not only about food or fire, it was also about knowledge. In these years of scarcity, memory was as fragile as life. How to find edible roots, how to cook toxins out of plants, how to track the last herds of animals. These were not universal skills. If an elder died, a lifetime of knowledge might vanish. But when groups joined, knowledge spread. One band taught another, and survival became a shared inheritance. Cooperation multiplied wisdom, while isolation shrank it. Speculation allows us to see how culture may have been born in these crucibles of unity. Imagine a cave where two tribes now shelter together. One paints on the walls figures of animals, spirals of fire. The other watches, learns, adds their own marks. In the blending of their art, a new tradition begins. Or picture a song sung around the fire, first in one dialect, then in another, until the words blur and a shared chant emerges. These acts of unity were not luxuries. They were survival, binding tribes together through shared memory and ritual. But the choice was not easy. Fear of strangers was real, and betrayal always possible. An alliance meant risk that food would be stolen, that fire would be lost, that trust would be broken. Not all attempts at unity succeeded. Some ended in blood, with one group slaughtered by another under the guise of friendship. Yet enough succeeded to carry humanity forward. The fact that we exist is proof that cooperation outweighed destruction, that some chose to trust when fear demanded otherwise. The shelters of unity may have been small, but their impact was vast. In them, humanity learned the power of collective survival. These alliances shaped the psychology of our species. Cooperation became instinct, embedded in us as deeply as the fear of hunger or the need for fire. We learned that together we endure longer, that unity transforms scarcity into resilience. This lesson carried forward into the future, into villages, into cities, into civilizations. The roots of society itself may lie in these desperate alliances, forged in ash and hunger. Speculation paints one final image, a circle of humans gathered around a shared fire. Their bodies are thin, their faces marked by hardship, but their eyes reflect the flames. Together around them, the world is silent, stripped bare by the eruption. But in their unity, there is continuity. They pass food hand to hand. They tell stories across tribes. They watch the fire as one. In that fragile circle lies the seed of all that came after. This was the choice that defined humanity in the volcanic winter. War destroyed tribes. Alliances preserved them. Unity was not guaranteed, but when chosen, it became the difference between extinction and endurance. And from this another thread emerges. How these memories of fire, famine, and survival carried forward, echoing into the myths of endless night, told by generations long after the skies cleared, long after the ash had settled and the skies had cleared, long after the volcanic winter released its grip on the earth. The memory of catastrophe lingered. It lived not in bones, not in stone, but in story. Across cultures, across continents, myths whisper of a time when the skies grew dark, when fire rained down, when floods swept the land, and when humanity trembled at the edge of annihilation. These are the myths of endless night, echoes of Toba's fury carried forward in words, preserved through generations who never saw the eruption, but felt its shadow in the marrow of their ancestry. Consider how myths often speak of the sky disappearing. In Mesopotamian tradition, stories tell of floods sent by gods, punishing humanity with destruction. In Hindu texts there are cycles of cosmic fire and darkness, ages swallowed by catastrophe. Indigenous peoples of Australia recall a time when fire rained from the heavens and the land itself burned. In the Pacific Islands, myths describe great waves and skies that turned black. Again and again, cultures remember a moment when the world seemed to end, when day collapsed into night. Could these not be distant echoes of the volcanic twilight, that wrapped the earth in darkness 74,000 years ago, speculation invites us to picture the first storytellers. Survivors of the volcanic winter gather around a fire, their bodies still thin with hunger, their faces shadowed by hardship. An elder speaks softly, telling of the time when the sun disappeared, when the land grew silent, when only fire remained. The children listen wide-eyed, committing the words to memory. In their minds, the story becomes both history and warning, a memory of what was endured, and a reminder that it could happen again. Over generations, the details shift. The mountain becomes a god, its eruption an act of divine wrath. The ash becomes smoke, the cold becomes flood, the endless night becomes the punishment of spirits. But beneath the shifting shapes, the core remains. The earth once turned against us, and we barely survived. In this way, myth becomes memory fossilized in story. Anthropologists argue that myth often encodes real events, reshaped through imagination. Flood myths, for example, may stem from rising seas at the end of the Ice Age, preserved in the oral tradition across continents. Likewise, the myths of fire, darkness, and endless night may preserve fragments of the Toba eruption. Our ancestors may not have written records, but they carried memory in story, passing it across generations like an ember carried in moss, fragile yet enduring. Speculation lets us imagine how these stories evolved. In East Africa, where refugees sustained life, tales may have spoken of a time when the sun was hidden, when only unity preserved the people. In South Asia, where ash fell thick, the stories may have described fire raining from the heavens, a punishment from the gods of the mountains. In Southeast Asia, closest to Toba's fury, the stories may have been darker still. The mountain tearing itself apart, the world ending in fire and ash. Over millennia, these stories traveled with migrations, transforming into myths told in distant lands. What is striking is the universality. From the Norse Ragnarok, where the sun is swallowed and fire consumes the world, to the Aztec myths of suns destroyed by catastrophe, to Polynesian tales of skies turned black, humanity remembers a recurring theme. The world nearly ended, and we survived by the narrowest margin. These patterns suggest not coincidence, but shared inheritance, the deep memory of a species scarred by a volcanic winter. Imagine the power of such stories for those who heard them. To a child born generations after Toba, the myth of endless night would have seemed almost unthinkable, a tale of gods and spirits. Yet beneath it lay truth. Their ancestors had lived through it. They had endured when the world darkened, and because of them the child was alive to listen. Myth thus carried not only fear, but pride. It told each generation, you are descended from survivors of apocalypse. Even today, when we hear these myths, they resonate. Something in us recognizes the weight of survival, the fragility of life against Earth's power. Perhaps this is because the memory is not only cultural, but biological. Our DNA still carries the signature of that bottleneck, the narrowing of humanity's numbers. We are, in a sense, living myths, embodiments of a story so old it predates civilization. Speculation suggests that these myths did more than preserve memory. They may have guided behavior. A tribe told of endless night might prepare more carefully for famine, storing food, guarding fire, teaching cooperation. The story passed from elder to child was not entertainment, but instruction, a manual for survival disguised as tale. In this way, the memory of Toba shaped not only imagination, but action. Picture a gathering in the centuries after the eruption. The air is still colder than before, the land still scarred. a storyteller raises their voice in the flicker of firelight. There was a time when the sun disappeared, when we thought the world had ended. But we did not end. We endured. The listeners, young and old, lean closer. They are not simply hearing history. They are being told who they are, the children of survivors, the heirs of resilience. This is the power of myth. It transforms catastrophe into identity. It turns ash and famine into symbols, lessons, memories that last longer than bones or tools. Myths of endless night are not simply stories of fear. They are stories of triumph, the memory that we faced the darkness and emerged alive. And yet, within this triumph, there is always the shadow. For every group that told the story, countless others never lived to tell it. Entire lineages were silenced, their myths extinguished with their fires. What survives in story is only part of the truth, the echo of those who endured, not the silence of those who did not. The myths of endless night are not just echoes of survival. They are also monuments to absence. In this way, they remind us of the fragility of memory itself. Just as myths preserve fragments of Toba, so too do they conceal as much as they reveal. They are riddles, whispers across millennia. Yet even in fragments they bind us to the deep past, reminding us that the human imagination is as much a tool of survival as fire or shelter. And from these myths another question rises. If the stories of endless night, preserved fragments of Toba, what else do they conceal? Could the collective memory of humanity still carry echoes of that volcanic winter, passed down in ways we scarcely recognize? To explore this, we must step deeper into the idea of memory itself. Not just cultural, but collective, the lingering imprint of catastrophe carried across ages. Memory is not only in words or stories, it is in blood, in instinct, in the quiet echoes that shape who we are without us ever naming them. Long after the volcanic ash of Toba settled into the soil, long after the skies brightened and the herds returned, humanity carried its shadow forward. Legends of apocalypse, of skies darkened, of fires consuming, of waters rising, may be fragments of that winter, but so too are the subtler patterns of fear and endurance woven into the fabric of our species. Humanity still remembers the ash in its bones. Consider how myths of destruction appear everywhere, among peoples who never shared a single storyteller. Floods, fire, darkness, famine. These themes repeat not by chance, but because they are rooted in something deeper than story. They are echoes of lived catastrophe, preserved across generations, not only in language, but in psychology. To fear the dark, to crave the safety of fire, to tell stories of worlds ending. These may be more than cultural quirks. They may be the collective memory of the volcanic winter that nearly ended us. Speculation lets us see this at the scale of the body. Imagine a hunter thousands of years after Toba, crouching at the edge of a forest. The skies are clear, the herds abundant, yet he feels unease when clouds gather, when the sun dims behind them. His heartbeat quickens, though he has never lived through famine. Perhaps it is not his memory, but the memory of his ancestors, encoded in instinct, warning him that when the sky grows dark, danger follows. This is collective memory, not a conscious story, but a reflex carved by catastrophe. Modern science hints at this possibility. Epigenetics suggests that trauma can leave marks not only on individuals, but on generations, shaping the way bodies respond to stress, the way minds react to fear. Could the near extinction of humanity under Toba have left such imprints? Could our anxiety at darkness, our fascination with fire, our ritual use of story, all be remnants of that ancient survival? It is speculation, but it resonates with the idea that catastrophe lingers, not only in myth but in marrow. Picture a fire-lit circle, tens of thousands of years ago. Survivors of the winter sit with children, teaching them through tale. There was a time when the sun vanished, a time when fire was all we had. Remember this. The children absorbed the words, not only as story but as caution. Generations later, the tale has shifted, gods added, spirits imagined, but the core remains. Beware the dark sky. The warning persists long after the eruption is forgotten. This is how memory moves, not only through fact but through meaning. Across cultures, this collective memory is refracted into legend. In Norse myth, Ragnarok speaks of a sun swallowed and a world reborn. In Hindu cosmology, cycles of destruction and renewal echo the rise and fall of light. In Pacific Island traditions, skies turned black and seas surged. In Africa, oral traditions speak of famine and fire. Each is different, yet all share the same rhythm: catastrophe, endurance, renewal. These patterns are not accidents. They are the collective memory of a species that once stood at the brink. Speculation deepens the picture. Perhaps the myths of endless night were not only warnings but also affirmations. By telling of apocalypse survived, our ancestors affirmed their resilience. They told their children not only that the world could end, but that it had ended once, and still life went on. These stories became more than memory. They became identity. Humanity defined itself not as untouched by catastrophe, but as shaped by it. Even today, in our fascination with doomsday tales, in our stories of worlds ending and beginning again, we may be echoing that same inheritance. We tell of meteors striking, of plagues spreading, of skies darkening, not because we expect them, but because somewhere deep in our lineage we remember when it happened. Our myths of the future are shadows of our memories of the past. Speculation lets us imagine this continuity more vividly. A tribe in Southeast Asia, generations after Toba, tells a story of the mountain that roared, of the sky that turned black, of the people who survived by fire and unity. Centuries later, their descendants tell of gods who battle in the heavens, their struggle blotting out the sun. Thousands of years later, still on another continent, the myth becomes a story of a flood sent by angry deities, a punishment survived only by a chosen few. The details change, the symbols shift, but the rhythm remains. Apocalypse, survival, rebirth. The collective memory persists, shape-shifting but unbroken. The power of this memory lies not in accuracy, but in persistence. Humanity does not remember the name of Toba, nor the precise year, nor the count of survivors, but it remembers the feeling, the darkness, the hunger, the firelight. It remembers the fragility of life and the necessity of endurance, and in that remembering, it carries the lesson forward. Survival is never given. It must be chosen, guarded, shared. Perhaps this is why our species is so bound to fire. Other animals fear flame. Humans embrace it. We cook with it, gather around it, worship it. Fire is not only practical, it is symbolic, sacred. Could this reverence be the echo of a time when fire was the only thing that kept us alive, when it was the thread between extinction and endurance? Our collective memory may not name Toba, but it enshrines its lessons in every firelit ritual, every myth of darkness, every story of renewal. Speculation gives us one final image. You sit by a fire today, perhaps in the wilderness, perhaps in your home. The flames move as they did for your ancestors 74,000 years ago. The crackle of wood, the warmth against your skin, the hypnotic dance of light, it soothes you in ways difficult to explain. You are safe, yet you feel the ancient resonance. Somewhere deep within, your body remembers that fire once meant survival in a world of ash. The comfort you feel is not only yours, it is inherited, collective, a memory as old as humanity itself. This is the collective memory of Toba, fragments of legend, echoes of fear, the instinctive pull toward fire, the caution at darkness, the fascination with endings and beginnings. Humanity still carries the ash of that winter, not in lungs or landscapes, but in bones, in genes, in story. And from this memory arises another truth, that the cost of survival was immense. For though humanity endured, most lineages did not. The bottleneck erased entire branches of our family tree, leaving behind only silence where once there was life. To understand this cost, we must turn to the shadow of absence, the countless lost, the ghost populations who vanished in the ash. Survival is rarely without sacrifice. When humanity emerged from the shadow of Toba's winter, it did so diminished, not only in number but in depth. The eruption and its aftermath had scoured the world of diversity, collapsing entire lineages into silence. Most families, most clans, most threads of the human story were erased forever. We are the descendants of only a tiny fraction. The survivors of a bottleneck so narrow it reduced the vastness of humanity into a fragile thread. Genetic evidence lays this truth bare. When scientists map the DNA of modern humans, they find a striking pattern. We are more alike than we should be. Two people, born continents apart, often share more similarity than two chimpanzees from the same forest. This homogeneity is not natural. It is the scar of catastrophe. It is the cost of survival, written into our very code. Speculation lets us glimpse the human faces behind this loss. Imagine a tribe living in the highlands of Asia, once thriving, once strong. Their hunters were skilled, their elders wise, their children many. But when the ash dimmed the skies and famine set in, they faltered. One by one their fires went out. When the last of them died, their lineage vanished, their stories erased, their memory carried only in the silence of absence. Or picture a coastal group in Southeast Asia, clinging to life by the sea. They endured for a time, eating shellfish and fish, but eventually the beds grew barren, storms destroyed their shelters, and the sea claimed them. They left no descendants. Their bloodlines ended on those shores. These were not isolated losses. Across Africa and Asia, across valleys, coasts, and plains, entire populations collapsed. The genetic bottleneck shows how narrow our passage became. Some estimates suggest fewer than 2,000 breeding individuals remained. That number is small enough to be wiped out by a single plague, a single drought, a single accident of chance. The fact that we are here at all is extraordinary, but it also means that every human alive today descends from an astonishingly small pool of survivors. The cost of this is seen in what was lost. Genetic diversity is resilience. It is the hidden strength of a species, the variations that allow adaptation to disease, to climate, to change. When the bottleneck stripped away most of humanity, it also stripped away countless genetic possibilities, traits, immunities, potentials, all gone with the lineages that carried them. The survivors endured, but they carried only fragments of what humanity once was. Speculation lets us feel this loss in cultural terms as well. Each vanished tribe carried songs, stories, techniques, and wisdom shaped by their landscapes. How to track an animal in snow, how to find roots in arid soil, how to heal with herbs known only to the region. When those tribes died, their knowledge died with them. Humanity did not lose only lives. It lost memories, cultures, entire ways of being. The silence of extinction is not only biological, it is also cultural. Imagine walking through the aftermath of this winter, generations later. The earth is healing, the skies are clearing, but the world feels emptier. The herds are returning, but the people are not. The land is dotted not with countless fires, but with only a few, each representing a fragile band of survivors. Entire valleys that once echoed with voices are now silent. Forests that once fed humans grow untended. Caves that once sheltered families lie abandoned, their fires long extinguished. For the survivors, the absence must have been palpable, the sense that the world had once been fuller, richer, more alive, but now was hollowed by loss. The cost of survival can also be seen in our present. Because of the bottleneck, we are genetically vulnerable. Diseases can spread more easily across our species because we lack the depth of variation that might have offered resistance. The echoes of Toba's winter still shape us today, limiting the resilience we might have had if more lineages had endured. We live with the consequences of survival as much as with its triumph. Yet within this loss, there is also a strange intimacy. Because our ancestors were so few, we are all close kin. Every human alive today is family, descended from the same narrow thread. Beneath the differences of culture, language, and appearance, our shared ancestry is recent, our genetic bonds undeniable. The cost of survival was diversity. The gift of survival was kinship. Speculation paints a haunting but humbling image. On a hillside 74,000 years ago, perhaps only a few hundred families remained. They did not know they were the future of humanity. They did not know that all who came after would descend from them. They were simply surviving, one day at a time. Yet from their persistence came us, all of us. The billions alive today are the children of that fraction, the echoes of a few fires burning in caves while the world froze. The cost of survival is in the end twofold. It is the silence of the lost, the erasure of lineages and knowledge, but it is also the weight of responsibility carried by those who endured. They bore the future unknowingly, and their endurance shaped everything that followed. This truth leads us to the next shadow. If most of humanity was lost, then who are we descendants of? And what of those who vanished entirely? The ghost populations whose bloodlines ended in the ash, their stories untold, their memory erased. To understand the full cost, we must turn to absence itself, and to the countless who did not survive. The story of Toba is not only about the fury of a mountain or the silence of a winter. It is about how close humanity came to vanishing. From millions, our numbers collapsed to only a few thousand souls, scattered, fragile, diminished, yet unbroken. We should not have survived. The odds were against us, and yet we did. In our DNA, we carry the record of that survival, the narrowing of our lineage, the cost of diversity lost. In our myths, we carry the memory of skies gone dark and fire that never died. In our instincts, we still feel the ancient pull of firelight, the old fear of darkness. The eruption did not end us, but it reshaped us, binding us to the truth that life is fragile and that endurance is never guaranteed. And so we are left with a question. Did we endure by chance, the lucky persistence of a few bands who happened to live in the right valleys, on the right shores, at the right time? Or was survival written into us, woven into our adaptability, our cooperation, our relentless will to continue? Was it luck, or was it something deeper, something that defines humanity itself? Speculation cannot give us certainty, but it allows us to feel the gravity of what happened. For every human alive today descends from those few who endured. Every heartbeat is an echo of their survival. Every fire we light, every story we tell, carries the shadow of their struggle. We are here not because survival was inevitable, but because it was won. Day by day, in the darkest of winters, Imagine them now, in your mind's eye, a handful of figures huddled in a cave, firelight flickering on stone. The air outside is thick with ash, the sky above forever grey. They press close, sharing warmth, sharing fear, sharing the fragile hope that tomorrow will come. They do not know that they alone carry the destiny of the human race. They know only that they must endure the night. And from their fire our world was born,